When meteorologists first saw the satellite images on January 15, 2019, they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. A massive Arctic air mass was descending from Canada, carrying with it temperatures so extreme that exposed skin would freeze in under 10 minutes. The wind chill factor was predicted to hit a bone-chilling -70 degrees Fahrenheit across the northern plains of Montana and North Dakota. Most sensible people would lock their doors, stoke their fires, and wait out nature's fury from the safety of their homes. But Jake Thompson wasn't most people. The 34-year-old rancher from Havre, Montana, had 247 head of cattle scattered across 3,000 acres of open prairie, and among them were 89 newborn calves who had been born just weeks before the storm hit. The National Weather Service issued its most severe warning in decades. Frostbite can develop in just half an hour when wind chill reaches these extreme levels. Emergency officials urged everyone to stay indoors. Roads would be impassable. Visibility would drop to zero. This was the kind of storm that could kill. But as Jake stood at his kitchen window that Tuesday morning, watching the first snowflakes begin to swirl in the pre-dawn darkness, he made a decision that would defy every piece of safety advice he'd ever heard. He was going out into that storm, because somewhere in that frozen wasteland, dozens of baby calves were fighting for their lives, and without his help, they wouldn't see another sunrise. The thermometer outside his farmhouse read -42 degrees. With the wind picking up to 35 miles per hour, the effective temperature on exposed flesh was already approaching -60. By evening, weather models predicted the wind chill would plummet to -70 degrees, a temperature so extreme that newborn calves are most at risk because they are wet and because they have a large surface area in relation to their total body mass. Jake had seen storms before, but nothing like this. His grandfather used to tell him stories about the Great Blizzard of 1905, when entire herds simply vanished into the white abyss, their frozen carcasses not discovered until spring thaw. It has been estimated that 70 to 80% loss from that historic storm, a catastrophe that bankrupted entire families and changed the landscape of American ranching forever. Hey folks, if you're enjoying this incredible true story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support keeps these amazing stories coming, but this storm threatened to be worse. Modern weather tracking had given Jake advance warning that his predecessors never had, yet the sheer ferocity of the approaching system made their advantages seem meaningless. The state experienced a week in late December, with temperatures that dropped lower than 40 degrees F with wind chill, the coldest weather the region had seen in nearly 3 decades. The radio crackled with emergency bulletins every few minutes. Schools were closing. Interstate highways were being shut down. The governor was declaring a state of emergency. Emergency shelters were opening in towns across the region as power grids strained under the extreme conditions. This wasn't just bad weather. This was a life-threatening emergency. Jake's wife, Sarah, pleaded with him to stay inside. Their 2 young children watched from the breakfast table as their parents argued in hushed tones about the wisdom of venturing out into what one meteorologist was calling a potential death trap. The local sheriff's department had already announced they would not be responding to non-emergency calls once the storm hit full force. But Jake understood something that the weather forecasters and emergency officials didn't grasp. Those weren't just numbers on his ledger books scattered across the frozen prairie. They were living, breathing creatures who depended entirely on him for survival. Newborn calves have a circulatory system that is less able to respond to cold changes as compared to more mature animals. Without immediate intervention, the calves would begin to experience hypothermia within hours. As he pulled on his heaviest winter gear, Jake knew he was about to embark on a race against time and nature itself. The storm was intensifying by the hour, and soon the window for any rescue attempt would close completely. He had perhaps 6 hours before conditions became utterly impossible, even for someone with his experience. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in ranching communities across the northern plains, a story of courage, determination, and the unbreakable bond between a rancher and his animals. But first, Jake Thompson had to survive what was about to become the most dangerous day of his life. To understand the magnitude of what Jake Thompson was about to attempt, you must first understand the deadly science of extreme cold. When wind chill reaches -70 degrees Fahrenheit, the human body begins to shut down in ways that defy comprehension. Extreme wind chill can freeze exposed skin in under 30 minutes, but at -70, that timeline compresses to mere minutes. The meteorological phenomenon unfolding over Montana that January morning was a perfect storm of Arctic air masses, jet stream patterns, and surface winds that created conditions not seen in the region for over 30 years. The state experienced a week in late December with temperatures that dropped lower than 40 degrees F with wind chill, the coldest weather the region had seen in nearly 3 decades. But it wasn't just humans who were at risk. Cattle, despite their reputation for cold hardiness, have very specific temperature thresholds beyond which they cannot survive. A cow's lower critical temperature, or the coldest it can handle, without added calories to burn, rests right around 32 degrees F. When temperatures drop significantly below this point, cattle must burn massive amounts of energy just to maintain their core body temperature. The most vulnerable of all are newborn calves. Newborn calves are most at risk because they are wet, and because they have a large surface area in relation to their total body mass. Born covered in amniotic fluid, these baby animals face a deadly countdown as soon as they emerge into freezing air. Their small bodies lose heat exponentially faster than adult cattle, and calves are not fully capable of maintaining temperature the first several hours of life. Dr. Paul Beck, Associate Professor of Animal and Food Sciences at Oklahoma State University, explains the physiological crisis that unfolds when cattle face extreme cold. For every degree colder than a cow's critical temperature, it requires a 1% increase in energy to survive the cold. The colder it gets, the more a cow needs to eat. At -70 degrees wind chill, this equation becomes impossible to sustain. The danger isn't just from the cold itself. Wind creates a convective cooling effect that strips away the thin layer of warm air that mammals naturally maintain around their bodies. Wind is often the biggest factor. The effect of wind is often referred to as wind chill and tells how living things feel the temperature. Wind chill is often many degrees colder than the actual temperature. For Jake's newborn calves, scattered across thousands of acres of open prairie, the approaching storm represented multiple threats simultaneously. First, their wet coats from birth would rapidly conduct heat away from their bodies. Second, their immature circulatory systems couldn't respond quickly enough to the temperature drop. Third, the combination of precipitation and wind would create conditions where snow or ice from freezing rain on calves dramatically increases heat loss. The timing couldn't have been worse. Late January is peak calving season across the northern plains, when ranchers typically see the majority of their annual births. Jake's herd had been producing calves at a steady rate throughout the month, with 89 newborns scattered across various pastures. Under normal winter conditions, these calves would huddle with their mothers for warmth and gradually adapt to the cold. But normal winter conditions in Montana rarely include sustained wind chill readings of -70 degrees. Even adult cattle face mortal danger in such extreme conditions. The USDA Livestock Indemnity Program considers 40 wind chill as extreme cold for mature cattle. The approaching storm would far exceed even these emergency thresholds, pushing into territory where thin cows in extreme cold may succumb to the elements. The ranch infrastructure that might normally provide shelter was woefully inadequate for conditions this severe. Most cattle operations in the region rely on natural windbreaks and basic three-sided shelters that work fine for typical winter weather. But when you're dealing with hurricane-force winds and Arctic temperatures, these structures become death traps. Where cattle must lie on snow, ice, or frozen ground, they will lose much more body heat. Jake understood the science intimately. He'd lost calves to cold before, though never under conditions this extreme. He knew that calves that freeze to death are unable to maintain a high enough body temperature to keep body processes working. He also knew that once hypothermia sets in, the process becomes irreversible without immediate intervention. What drove Jake forward wasn't ignorance of the danger. It was full comprehension of what would happen if he stayed inside. By the time the storm passed, most, if not all, of his newborn calves would be dead, frozen solid where they fell. The economic loss would be devastating, but for Jake, the emotional cost would be even worse. These weren't just livestock, they were animals he'd helped bring into the world, and now they needed him to keep them in it. As he finished loading his emergency supplies and prepared to venture into the storm, Jake carried with him the weight of scientific certainty. At -70 degrees wind chill, He was about to enter a killing zone where human survival is measured in minutes, not hours. Jake Thompson zipped up his insulated coveralls and pulled his balaclava down over his face, leaving only his eyes exposed behind protective goggles. The temperature had already dropped to -48 degrees, and the wind was howling at 42 miles per hour, creating a wind chill that registered -68 degrees on his truck's digital thermometer. He was stepping into conditions that could kill him within 10 minutes of exposure. His modified Ford F-350 was equipped with a diesel engine warmer, studded tires, and a custom-built cattle trailer designed for emergency rescues. In the truck bed, he'd loaded emergency supplies that could mean the difference between life and death: industrial-grade animal warmers, thick canvas tarps, emergency feed pellets, and a generator powerful enough to run heating equipment in the field. Remember to subscribe if you're enjoying this incredible rescue story, and drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. I love hearing from viewers all around the world. The first challenge came before he'd even left his driveway. The truck's door handles had frozen solid, and he had to use a blow dryer to thaw them enough to open the cab. The diesel fuel, despite being treated with anti-gel additives, was thickening in the subarctic temperatures. The engine groaned and protested as it fought against oil that was becoming as viscous as molasses. As he pulled out onto the county road, visibility was already dropping to near zero. The snow wasn't falling, heavily yet, but the wind was picking up existing snow from the ground and hurling it horizontally across the landscape in stinging, blinding sheets. His headlights reflected off the swirling snow, creating a disorienting tunnel effect that made it nearly impossible to distinguish the road from the surrounding prairie. Jake's first destination was the North Pasture, where he'd spotted a group of cows with calves 3 days earlier during routine feeding. It was a 2-mile drive under normal conditions, but in these circumstances, it took him nearly 30 minutes of careful navigation. Twice he had to stop and get out to clear ice from his windshield wipers, each time risking frostbite exposure as the -70-degree wind chill tore through his protective clothing. When he finally reached the pasture gate, what he found nearly broke his heart. 3 adult cows were huddled against a fence line, their backs turned to the wind, ice crystals coating their faces where their breath had frozen. Between their legs, barely visible in the blowing snow, were 2 calves, alive but clearly struggling. The calves were shivering violently, a sign that their bodies were burning their last reserves of energy trying to maintain core temperature. Getting to them meant leaving the relative safety of his truck and venturing into the full fury of the storm. The choice between personal well-being and caring for livestock can prove difficult for many farmers and ranchers, but for Jake there was no choice at all. Those calves would be dead within the hour without intervention. He pulled on his heaviest winter gloves, thick leather outer shells with wool liner gloves underneath, and stepped into hell. The wind hit him like a physical force, nearly knocking him off his feet. The cold was so intense it felt like needles stabbing through his clothing. Within seconds, the moisture from his breath had frozen into a layer of ice around his face. Mask. Reaching the first calf took every ounce of strength and determination he possessed. Each step through the knee-deep snow was a battle against wind, so fierce it threatened to lift him off his feet. The calf, a small black Angus cross, weighing maybe 60 pounds, was barely conscious. Its breathing was shallow and rapid, clear signs of hypothermia setting in. Jake knew he had to work fast. Frostbite is the damage to body tissues that occurs when these tissues freeze. Both he and the calf were at immediate risk. Using techniques he'd learned from veterinary manuals and bitter experience, he wrapped the calf in a pre-warmed canvas tarp and began the treacherous journey back to his truck. The weight of the calf, combined with the resistance of the wind and deep snow, made the 50-yard trip feel like a mile. Halfway back, Jake slipped on ice hidden beneath the snow and went down hard, managing to protect the calf, but jarring his knee so severely he wasn't sure he could continue. But failure wasn't an option, not with dozens more calves scattered across the ranch, all fighting the same desperate battle against time and temperature. Loading the first calf into the heated trailer was just the beginning. The second calf was in even worse condition, its body temperature so low that it had stopped shivering, a dangerous sign that hypothermia was entering its final stages. When a calf is born in frigid temperatures and we realize that they're not responding to their mother like they should, it's critical to raise its core body temperature as quickly as possible. As Jake secured the second calf and cranked up the trailer's heating system, he faced a grim reality check. He'd been outside for less than an hour, and already his fingers were numb despite his heavy gloves. His feet were losing feeling, and ice was forming around his eyes where tears from the wind had frozen. The storm was still intensifying, and he had barely begun what would need to be a ranch-wide rescue operation. But in the heated trailer behind him, 2 calves were already showing signs of recovery. It was working. The question now was whether Jake could survive long enough to save the rest of them. By 10:30 a.m., Jake had been battling the storm for over 3 hours, and the true scope of the crisis was becoming clear. His ranch's 3,000 acres were scattered with cattle groups, each potentially harboring newborn calves in desperate need of rescue. The wind chill had now reached its predicted -70 degrees, creating conditions so severe that exposed skin would freeze solid in under 5 minutes. His truck's radio crackled with emergency bulletins. The National Weather Service was calling it a potentially life-threatening weather event. State Patrol had closed all highways. Emergency services were suspending operations until the storm passed. Jake Thompson was alone in a frozen wilderness where nature itself had become the enemy. The second pasture presented new challenges. Located on the eastern slope of a small hill, it was fully exposed to the howling Arctic wind. As Jake approached in his truck, he could see dark shapes moving against the white backdrop, cattle trying to find shelter where none existed. Among them, barely visible in the blowing snow, were the telltale smaller forms of calves. What he discovered when he reached them nearly brought him to tears. 6 calves were down in the snow, their mothers standing over them helplessly. 2 of the calves weren't moving at all. Calves that freeze to death are unable to maintain a high enough body temperature to keep body processes working. Jake feared he was too late for some of them, but ranchers don't give up easily. Using a technique he'd learned from other cattlemen, Jake checked each calf for signs of life. The first 2 were indeed gone, their small bodies already stiffening in the brutal cold, but the other 4 were still breathing, though barely. Their body temperatures had dropped so low that they'd entered a state of suspended animation, hovering on the very edge between life and death. The rescue process for each calf was becoming increasingly dangerous for Jake himself. Wind chill is often many degrees colder than the actual temperature. At -70 degrees wind chill, every moment of exposure was potentially fatal. His movements were becoming sluggish. As his own body temperature dropped, ice was forming inside his protective goggles, limiting his vision. Yet Jake pressed on, driven by a determination that transcended personal safety. People have such a strong connection to their animals, and they feel a huge responsibility to take care of them. Each successful rescue energized him for the next challenge, even as his body was reaching its physical limits. Loading the 3rd and 4th calves into his heated trailer, Jake made a crucial discovery. The animal warmers he'd brought were proving to be lifesavers. An animal warmer looks somewhat like a large dog carrier. It's big enough for a calf to lie down or stand inside it. Like its name suggests, the animal warmer has a small heater that circulates air around the calf and helps dry off and regain its body heat. By noon, Jake had successfully rescued 8 calves from 3 different pastures. His trailer was full, and he needed to transport them to the heated barn before attempting to reach the remaining scattered groups. But the drive back to headquarters was becoming treacherous as the storm continued to intensify. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. The truck's GPS was useless in the whiteout conditions, and Jake was navigating by memory and instinct alone. Twice he became disoriented and had to stop the truck to wait for brief breaks in the blowing snow to re-establish his bearings. The weight of the loaded trailer made the vehicle unstable on the ice-covered roads. At one point, disaster nearly struck. While navigating a slight downhill slope, the truck began to slide sideways on black ice hidden beneath the snow. For a terrifying moment, Jake felt the vehicle going out of control, the trailer jackknifing behind him. Only quick thinking and years of experience driving in winter conditions allowed him to regain control and avoid a crash that could have killed both him and the calves he was trying to save. When he finally reached the main barn, the relief was overwhelming. The building's interior temperature of 45 degrees felt tropical compared to the -70-degree hell outside. Jake unloaded the calves one by one, placing each in individual warming stalls bedded with thick straw. On our farm, numerous calves have been saved thanks to the calf warmer. The sight of the rescued calves beginning to recover gave Jake the strength he needed for what came next. Radio reports indicated the storm would continue for at least another 6 hours, and potentially much longer. Weather models showed the wind chill remaining at or below -65 degrees for the rest of the day. There were still dozens of calves scattered across the ranch, each one fighting the same desperate battle against hypothermia and death. Jake refueled his truck, checked his emergency supplies, and prepared for another journey into the storm. His wife Sarah called on the radio, begging him to wait until conditions improved. Emergency officials were advising against any unnecessary travel. Common sense dictated that he should stay in the warm barn and hope for the best. But Jake Thompson wasn't a common man facing common circumstances. Somewhere out there in that frozen wasteland were more calves who would die without his help. As he climbed back into his truck and drove out into the howling storm, he carried with him the knowledge that he was their only hope for survival. By 2 p.m., Jake had been fighting the storm for nearly 7 hours, and his body was reaching the breaking point. Despite his heavy winter clothing, the repeated exposure to -70-degree wind chill was taking a devastating toll. His fingers, even inside insulated gloves, were numb and clumsy. His feet had lost most sensation, and he was beginning to stumble more frequently as coordination became difficult. The fourth pasture nearly proved to be his undoing, located nearly 4 miles. From the main ranch buildings, it required navigating a winding dirt road that had become invisible beneath wind-sculpted snowdrifts. 3 times Jake's truck became stuck in snow so deep it reached the wheel wells. Each time, he had to get out in the killing cold to dig himself free, using a shovel with hands that could barely maintain their grip. When he finally reached the remote pasture, what he found was heartbreaking. A group of 12 cows had gathered in the lee of a small grove of cottonwood trees, seeking what little shelter the bare branches could provide. Among them were 7 calves, but the brutal reality of extreme cold was evident everywhere. 3 calves lay motionless in the snow, their small bodies already claimed by the storm. The surviving calves were in various stages of hypothermia. Newborn calves have a special body tissue called brown adipose tissue that is designed to help them deal with cold temperatures. During cold temperatures, this special fat is broken down and creates heat that helps the calf keep warm. But even this natural defense mechanism had limits, and several of the calves had exhausted their reserves. Jake's own condition was becoming critical. The repeated exposure was causing his core body temperature to drop, and he was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia himself. His thinking was becoming fuzzy, and simple tasks like opening the truck door required enormous effort. Hypothermia. This is when your body's core temperature falls dangerously low. Symptoms include uncontrollable shivering, confusion, sluggish speech, and drowsiness. But stopping wasn't an option. Each successful rescue had shown him that calves could survive if rescued quickly enough. When a calf is born in frigid temperatures, and we realize that they're not responding to their mother like they should, it's critical to raise its core body temperature as quickly as possible. The rescue of the 4th group nearly killed him. The deepest snowdrifts forced Jake to break trail through snow that reached his waist, while carrying calves that weighed between 50 and 70 pounds each. The physical exertion in extreme cold was like nothing he'd ever experienced. Each breath seared his lungs, and the effort required to move through the snow left him gasping for air that felt like liquid ice. Halfway through rescuing the group, Jake collapsed. The combination of extreme cold, physical exhaustion, and the beginning stages of hypothermia had pushed his body past its limits. He fell face first into a snowdrift, the calf he was carrying tumbling from his arms. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he lay there in the snow, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was attempting. But as he struggled to regain his footing, Jake's eyes fell on the calf he'd been carrying. The small animal was still breathing, its chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths as Tad fought to maintain life. In that moment, Jake found reserves of strength he didn't know he possessed. Not at all, to be honest with you. As soon as I saw it, man, I kicked them boots off, jeans off, and I was going in there. The final calf in the group was the most challenging save of the day. It had become separated from the herd and was lying alone in an open area, fully exposed to the wind. By the time Jake reached it, the calf's breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible. Its body temperature had dropped so low that it had stopped shivering, the final warning sign before complete system shutdown. Using emergency warming techniques he'd learned from veterinary manuals, Jake wrapped the calf in multiple layers of insulation and placed chemical hand warmers against its core body areas. The race back to his truck became a desperate sprint against time, with Jake stumbling and falling repeatedly in the deep snow, while protecting the barely alive calf. Loading this group into his trailer, Jake faced a sobering reality. His truck was now carrying 11 rescued calves, but he'd also had to leave 3 dead ones behind. The storm showed no signs of abating, and weather reports indicated it would continue through the night. There were still more cattle scattered across distant pastures, but Jake wasn't sure he could survive another rescue run. His radio crackled with an urgent message from his wife, Sarah. The local sheriff's department had called the ranch house, expressing concern about Jake's safety. Emergency officials were preparing search and rescue operations for anyone caught in the storm. The message was clear. Even professional emergency responders considered current conditions unsurvivable. As Jake sat in his truck, engine idling to keep the trailer heated, he faced the hardest decision of his life. He could return to the safety of the barn with the 11 calves he'd already saved, knowing he'd accomplished something remarkable, or he could continue his rescue efforts, knowing that each additional trip into the storm brought him closer to becoming a casualty himself. Through the frosted windshield, Jake could see the dark shapes of cattle in the distance, scattered across pastures he hadn't yet reached. Somewhere among those shapes were more calves, each one fighting the same desperate battle against time and temperature. The storm was far from over, but neither was Jake Thompson. At 4 p.m., with daylight beginning to fade and the storm showing no mercy, Jake made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Despite his deteriorating physical condition and the mounting danger, he would continue the rescue operation. Somewhere in the vast expanse of his ranch, calves were still fighting for survival, and he was their only hope. The 5th pasture was the most remote location on the ranch, accessible only by a ranch road that hadn't been plowed in 3 days. The truck struggled through snow that reached the bottom of the door frames, with Jake having to rock the vehicle back and forth to maintain momentum. At one point, the truck became so deeply buried that Jake had to spend 20 precious minutes digging it out with his hands, as his shovel had broken on the previous rescue. When he finally crested the hill overlooking the distant pasture, Jake's heart nearly stopped. Through the swirling snow, he could see a large group of cattle clustered together in what ranchers call a death circle, a desperate formation where animals huddle so tightly together that calves can be trampled or suffocated. We have also had cattle during blizzards and below zero temperatures, and many calves get trampled as the cattle try to huddle together to stay alive. The approach to this group was the most dangerous yet. The cattle, stressed by the extreme conditions, had become unpredictable and potentially aggressive. Mother cows protecting calves in crisis conditions can become violent, and Jake was too exhausted to react quickly if charged by a 1,000-pound animal. But as he moved closer, he discovered something that renewed his hope. The cattle had instinctively arranged themselves to create a natural windbreak, with the largest animals forming an outer wall against the storm, while smaller cows and calves sheltered in the center. This survival behavior had saved lives. Jake counted 9 calves still on their feet within the protection of the herd circle, their mothers having created a pocket of relatively calm air in the storm's fury. But 3 calves had been pushed outside the protective circle and were lying motionless in the snow. Time was critical. Weather conditions have a great effect on the risk of frostbite and hypothermia, above and beyond just creating low temperatures. At -70-degree wind chill, these calves had minutes, not hours, before hypothermia became irreversible. The rescue of this group required a different strategy. Rather than attempting to carry each calf individually through the deep snow, Jake used his truck to create a temporary windbreak, positioning the vehicle between the calves and the worst of the storm. This innovation allowed him to load 3 calves much more quickly, though each one showed varying degrees of cold exposure. The first calf was barely responsive, its breathing so shallow that Jake initially feared it was dead. Using emergency warming techniques, he discovered the animal was in a state of cold-induced suspended animation, alive but with all bodily functions slowed to the minimum necessary for survival. On our farm, numerous calves have been saved thanks to the calf warmer. This calf would need immediate intensive care to survive. The second and third calves were in better condition, though both showed signs of frostbite on their ears and tails. Frozen ears and tails result in changes of cattle appearance, but do not affect cattle performance significantly. These injuries were permanent, but not life-threatening, battle scars from their fight against nature's fury. By 5:30 p.m., full darkness had settled over the ranch, and Jake was operating by truck headlights and instinct alone. The temperature had plateaued at its lowest point, with sustained wind chill readings of -72 degrees. Emergency officials were reporting that this was among the most severe cold events in Montana's recorded history. Jake's truck was now carrying 14 rescued calves, but his fuel gauge was approaching empty. The repeated trips through deep snow, the constant idling to keep the trailer heated, and the strain of operating in extreme conditions had consumed more fuel than anticipated. He faced a critical decision: return to base with the calves he'd saved, or attempt one final rescue run to the most distant pasture. The deep radio provided his answer. Sarah's voice crackled through the static, reporting that the calves from his earlier rescues were recovering well in the heated barn. Several had already begun eating, and veterinary checks showed that all would survive without permanent damage. The success of his efforts so far gave Jake the determination he needed for one last push. The final pasture was 1.5 miles beyond the previous location, in an area where Jake sometimes grazed cattle during summer months. Under normal conditions, it would be a 20-minute drive. In the current storm, it took him over an hour of careful navigation through drifted roads and whiteout conditions. What he found there would become the defining moment of his rescue operation. A lone cow stood guard over twin calves, newborns no more than 2 days old. The cow had somehow managed to keep both calves alive through pure maternal instinct, using her own body as a shield against the killing wind. All 3 animals were on the verge of collapse, but all 3 were still alive. Jake Thompson was about to attempt the most dangerous rescue of the day, saving 3 lives that represented the triumph of survival against impossible odds. But first, he had to survive the rescue attempt himself. At 6:45 p.m., nearly 12 hours after beginning his rescue operation, Jake Thompson faced the most perilous moment of the entire day. The lone cow with her twin calves stood in an exposed hollow where the wind had sculpted the snow into knife-sharp ridges. The mother cow, a red Angus cross he recognized as one of his most reliable producers, had used her own body to shield her babies from the killing wind. But all 3 animals were now at the absolute limit of their endurance. The approach required every skill Jake had learned in 20 years of ranching. The mother cow, stressed beyond comprehension and protective of her calves, could easily injure or kill him if she perceived him as a threat. Moving slowly and speaking in the calm tones that cattle recognize, Jake worked his way through the snow toward the small family group. The twin calves were barely alive. Born just 2 days earlier, they had survived the storm only because their mother had maintained an almost supernatural vigil, never leaving their sides despite her own desperate condition. You think about a fresh baby coming out of the womb soaking wet, and it hits -20 degrees. Weather. It can be instant, you've got to be on it. These calves had survived conditions far worse than -20 degrees. Getting all 3 animals to safety required a strategy Jake had never attempted before. Using extra rope from his truck, he fashioned a makeshift sled from a large piece of plywood he carried for emergencies. The plan was to load both calves onto the sled and drag them to the truck while leading their mother alongside. It was risky. If the mother cow became agitated, she could trample the calves or attack Jake himself. The first calf loaded onto the sled without incident, too weak from cold exposure to resist. But the second calf, slightly larger and more alert, panicked when Jake picked it up. Its distressed calls immediately triggered a protective response from the mother cow, who lowered her head and advanced toward Jake with clear, aggressive intent. For a terrifying moment, Jake found himself trapped between a charging 200-pound cow and deep snow that made quick movement impossible. Only years of experience reading cattle behavior saved him. He dropped low and made himself appear non-threatening while making soothing sounds that gradually calmed the agitated mother. The technique worked. The cow stopped her charge just feet away, snorting clouds of frozen breath in the -72-degree air. The journey back to the truck with the makeshift sled was a nightmare of physical endurance. The plywood sled, loaded, with 2 calves weighing a combined 120 pounds, carved deep furrows in the snow that Jake had to navigate while keeping the worried mother cow calm. Each step was a battle against snow that reached his thighs and wind that threatened to knock him down. Halfway to the truck, disaster nearly struck again. The sled hit a hidden rock and overturned, spilling both calves into the snow. One of the calves, already weakened by hypothermia, stopped breathing. Jake immediately began emergency resuscitation techniques he'd learned from veterinary manuals, performing chest compressions and artificial respiration on the tiny animal while fighting to maintain his own stability in the howling wind. For what felt like an eternity, the calf showed no response. Its body temperature had dropped so low that its systems had almost completely shut down, but Jake refused to give up. When a calf is born in frigid temperatures, and we realize that they're not responding to their mother, like they should, it's critical to raise its core body temperature as quickly as possible. Using body heat and friction, he gradually coaxed life back into the small animal. The moment when the calf's eyes opened and it took its first gasping breath was the emotional climax of Jake's entire rescue operation. Against all odds, in conditions that should have been unsurvivable, life had triumphed over death. The calf was weak and would need intensive care, but it was alive. Loading the final group into his truck took the last reserves of Jake's strength. His hands were so numb that he could barely operate the trailer latches, and his vision was becoming blurry from exhaustion and cold exposure. But with 17 calves now safely loaded into the heated trailer, Jake began the final journey back to the ranch headquarters. The drive back became a race against time and fuel. The truck's gas gauge was well into the red zone, and Jake wasn't certain he had enough fuel to make it home. The storm continued to rage with undiminished fury, and visibility remained near zero. But one by one, familiar landmarks emerged from the blowing snow, guiding him toward safety. When the lights of the main barn finally appeared through the storm, Jake felt a surge of emotion that nearly overwhelmed him. He had done something that most people would consider impossible. In 12 hours of continuous operation in -70-degree wind chill conditions, he had rescued 17 calves from certain death without losing a single one of the animals he'd found alive. The unloading process in the warm barn was like a scene from a miracle story. Calf after calf emerged from the heated trailer, most showing signs of recovery already beginning. Several were standing steadily, others were beginning to seek food, and even the weakest were responding to the life-saving warmth of the barn environment. As Jake finally allowed himself to warm up in the barn office, the full magnitude of what he'd accomplished began to sink in. Weather reports confirmed that the wind chill had indeed reached -72 degrees, among the most extreme cold events in Montana's history. Emergency services had suspended all operations. Professional rescue teams had declared conditions unsurvivable, yet Jake Thompson, a 34-year-old rancher driven by nothing more than love for his animals and stubborn determination, had ventured into that frozen hell 17 times and brought back 17 lives that would otherwise have been lost. When morning came and the storm finally passed, Jake's heroic rescue would become legend in ranching communities across the northern plains. Proof that sometimes human courage and determination can triumph even over nature's worst fury. Today, all 17 calves survived to adulthood, and Jake Thompson still ranches the same land where he staged his impossible rescue. But on quiet winter evenings, when the wind howls across the Montana prairie, Jake still remembers the day when refusing to stay inside meant the difference between life and death for 17 small creatures who depended entirely on his courage to see another sunrise.